So thank you for joining us, and thank you very much to Professor Paul Thomas for doing our seminar presentation today. The format will be that I'll just briefly introduce Paul Thomas, then he'll do a usual kind of 45-minute length presentation. Then, of course, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We'll use the chat function or the Q&A function for people to feed in questions, because there'll be too many people for us to see all on one screen. So some people may be trying to get in and we won't know they're trying to get in, and so on. So I think without further ado, let me just say a few words about Paul and then we can get started. So Paul is one of those academics who actually had an existence prior to becoming an academic. He's a qualified youth and community worker, which means he was a youth and community worker, and he then went on to work for the Commission for Racial Equality in the north of England. He is now a professor of youth and policy and Associate Dean for Research in the School of Education at the University of Huddersfield. Paul's research focuses on how multicultural policies such as community cohesion and prevent counterterrorism strategy have been understood and implemented by the ground level policymakers and practitioners, particularly educationalists such as youth workers, community workers and teachers, and also how they've been experienced by communities. It has led to books such as Youth Multiculturalism and Community Cohesion, which came out in 2011, and Responding to the Threat of Violent Extremism, Failing to Prevent, which came out a year later, as well as articles in many leading journals. The title of Paul's talk, as you know, but I'll just remind you, is White Lives Matter, Burnley, the white working class and racialized resentment in the M62 Corridor region. And as perhaps you're also aware, the talk is based on a book that Paul and co-authors have just published, and I'll let Paul introduce the book and his talk himself. Thank you, Paul. Over to you.
Thanks, Tarek, and hello, everyone. It's really nice to be with you, although we're not here in person, and that's particularly disappointing because, as you can probably tell already, this isn't a Yorkshire accent. I actually grew up in North Bristol, so I'm really disappointed that we can't be together. And I have been watching from a distance with a lot of interest events in Bristol over the last few months. I spent a fair bit of my teenage years in the Colston Hall, seeing great bands like the Ramones and the Stranglers and Stiff Little Fingers, which obviously shows my age as well. But like many people of my age and my background, I knew far too little about Edward Colston and the other sort of people of his ilk. So the last few months has been educative for me. But I guess it's another facet of the events during the Black Lives Matter sort of protests and events of the last few months that I've taken as the rather provocative sort of title for this talk. White Lives Matter Burnley comes from a banner that was flown by an aeroplane over the Premier League game between Manchester City and Burnley in July when football restarted. And it could clearly easily be understood as a statement of white privilege or even of white supremacy, particularly as the people who organised it and paid for it were well-known football hooligans with very clear links to the English Defence League and to Tommy Robinson himself. But I've chosen that as a title, and I appreciate it is a provocative one, because arguably it speaks to sort of broader issues that I want to talk about in today's presentation, and they're in one of the key chapters of the book that Tarek mentioned that I'm going to sort of talk about. And that is sort of broader senses in some strands of white communities in the M62 Corridor region in the north of England, who feel that they are not equally seen as mattering. So arguably that White Lives Matter statement for them is a concern about inferiority or perceived inferiority, not a statement of supremacy. I also felt it was a helpful title because Burnley, as the town that it came from, is resonant of the ex-industrial towns in the region that I want to sort of talk about. And it is very much both towns and the region as a whole that I want to focus on. So I'm going to sort of do a couple of things. For the first few minutes, I just want to give you a sense about the overall book and its key arguments, because that really frames the more specific topic and the more specific arguments I want to make about today's subject. And then I want to obviously talk in more detail about this concept of the white working class and some of the ways that there seems to be types of racialized resentment. So if you just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to switch to the slides that I'm going to use today. So, as Tarek said, I work in the School of Education and Professional Development at the University of Huddersfield, and we're all part of the Centre for Research in Education and Society. And what we are, the book that Tarek mentioned is part of the series that that Tarek actually co-edits with Baron Uberoy and Nasser Mir, the Palgrave Politics of Identity and Citizenship series. And as you can see, it's written with my co-authors Shamim Miah and Pete Sanderson. You may well be familiar with their work. We've worked a lot together, both in pairs and as three, over a whole range of research projects over the last 20 years. And I will say a little bit more about our motivation for this as we go on. But first, apologies if you know this already, but I'm aware that I'm talking to an audience that's largely not in the M62 corridor region. So here's our sort of map of the region, and it gives you some sense of the M62 motorway that goes from east to west. At one end, it's Liverpool, at the other end is Hull. Obviously, the Pennines in the middle, with Lancashire on one side, Yorkshire on the other side. Obviously, the map's slightly out of date because it doesn't tell you which tier each area is. So in current talk, Lancashire and Greater Manchester to the west of the Pennines is tier 3. Sheffield to the south and Rotherham are now in tier 3, but West Yorkshire's holding out at tier 2. I suspect not for much longer. But we've named some of the towns that we're concerned with in the book there, and it is events in some of those towns that's really been a thread going through the book. So why have we written this book as a whole? Well, what we've wanted to do is take on the concept of failed space of multiculturalism, both in political discourse and in media discourse over the last 10 to 20 years, and particularly from the 2001 riots in Oldham, Burnley and Bradford. There's been a repeated trope that multiculturalism has failed in the north of England. We're using multiculturalism in both senses that Stuart Hall identified. So multiculturalist policies are being blamed for failure, for making segregation, racial tension, resentment worse through their divide and rule sort of policies. But also it's multiculturalism in the more mundane experience of everyday ethnic diversity. So in a more profound level, there's also the suggestion that it's not working, that it can't work. So these sort of critiques seem to draw on almost Huntington's sort of concept of the clash of civilizations, particularly suggesting that white communities and largely Muslim and the main BME communities in the M62 corridor region are Muslim communities. the suggestion that they're incompatible and that it's not possible to work. Now, this is not just applied to the north of England. It's the similar critique has been applied to, say, the outer banlieue of Paris, to parts of inner city Brussels, to say the western suburbs of Sydney. So it's a critique, that a spatial critique that is aimed both at policy but also at multicultural reality per se. And we wanted to sort of take that on and use a number of sort of frames to sort of take that on. So firstly, we are overtly, by talking about the M62 corridor region, we are putting forward a regional level of analysis. And I think that's an important point to make. There's been some excellent work at the national level about multicultural experience and multicultural policy. Obviously, Tariq's own work is a key part of that. Yesterday, I was with Adrian Flavel at Leeds University. Obviously, Adrian's written about ideologies and of integration. We've also had sort of concepts of frames of integration. So there's been national work about different national ideologies, philosophies, and frames of integration. And there's a long history of excellent sociological work about multicultural reality and policy enactment at very local level, right from the work of John Rex in Birmingham and the West Midlands in the 1960s onwards. What we felt there was less of is this sense of a regional analysis. And if I just go back, I guess one of the key arguments we're making is that this region is a unified region by a lot more than the motorway, because this region was made by the textile industry, the Industrial Revolution, the textile industry of the 19th century, which was still booming well up to the 1950s and 60s. As late as the 1960s, towns like Huddersfield were very, very prosperous, almost entirely built on the textile industry and associated engineering. So just as the region was made as one of shared experience with industrial development and growth, in some ways it has been altered as a region profoundly by the deindustrialization. Another key point we want to draw on is we challenge the failed space of multiculturalism trope as being profoundly ahistorical. And here we're drawing very much on urban studies conceptions of sociology, looking particularly at some of the American sociology of the Chicago School and following that, which really analyzes what do we know in history and in different situated locations about migrant integration processes. And what they identify is how long, involved, and contested and varied those forms of integration are. One of the examples we use in the book's introduction is the profound resentment and hatred that was faced by, say, Irish Catholic migrants to the north of England in the 19th century, came to work in the textile industry, and how long it took for both them and the Jewish communities from Eastern Europe that followed to be accepted and to become integrated. So we're arguing that some of the coverage, particularly of so-called Muslim failures or refusals to integrate, is profoundly ahistorical about how assimilation, integration happens over generations in what forms it takes. And the third interrelated key theme is a renewed concern with political economy. It feels like far too much debate, both in academia as well as in politics and the media, is almost at the cultural level. There's little concern with how political economy shapes experience, shapes identifications, and shapes possibilities. So the profound economic changes that I've identified from the 1970s onwards in the region, the deindustrialization, but also the policy responses or the lack of them. One of our key arguments is that the M62 corridor region is in profound difficulty because of the era of neoliberalism, a total failure to create and generate new forms of productive work and secure work in the region following the decline of the textile industry. So we argue that if political economy is not considered, we're only seeing half the picture of multicultural experience. So to analyze this throughout the book, we're drawing on our own body of empirical research by ourselves and also by others. And Tariq very kindly identified my life before being an academic, but that was equally true for my colleagues Shamim and Pete. So Shamim was a policy officer in Oldham. He's also been very much a community activist. Pete has worked in further education teaching. He was a social researcher in Bradford in the 1970s. So we're drawing on our own professional experience and actually our own experience as activists in communities in race equality work, as well as our academic research. And I think one thing we'd highlight about the failed space of multiculturalism overarching sort of perspective on the book is how much particular events and events in situated locations in the M62 region since the 1980s have not only created this perception of the region itself, but they've also become markers for multicultural tension and failure in the UK itself. So when David Cameron made his Munich Security Conference speech in 2011, talked about multiculturalism having failed, he actually name-checked some of these events and places in the north of England. So of course we have the Honeyford schools dispute and then the Satanic Verses protest in Bradford in the 1980s. We have the Dewsbury schools boycott by white parents later in the 1980s who didn't want their children to go to primary school that was predominantly of Asian background. We had those 2001 Northern riots, which really foregrounded the perception that there was profound segregation and a failure of multiculturalism across Britain, and ushered in this concern with community cohesion, which, you know, Tariq and Nasser have identified as a rebalancing of multiculturalism, but others have been much more sort of critical of and claimed is a lurch back to assimilationism. We've seen political manifestations, electoral gains by the BNP in Burnley and other parts of the north directly after the 2001 riots. The English Defence League in many ways was born in the north of England. Certainly some of the most well-attended rallies and the most active sort of events were in different towns. They came, for instance, repeatedly to Dewsbury in their thousands. And subsequently to that, we've had the Brexit vote, which I want to go on and argue has a direct lineage from some of those political manifestations. Colleagues will be aware of the successive child sexual exploitation cases in Keighley, Rochdale, Rotherham, Huddersfield that have been highly racialised in the way that far-right activists have tried to exploit them, the way they've been portrayed as profoundly being a racial cultural problem rather than a criminal one. And how these have become of international renown. So Branton Tarrant, who was the terrorist who carried out the mosque attack in New Zealand, actually name-checked Rotherham in his manifesto that he issued just before he carried out that attack. And that leads on to terrorism. Obviously, the 7/7 attackers came from West Yorkshire, and there have been subsequent plots by people in the north of England. And we've had the murder of Joe Cox MP, who was one of the local MPs to the Huddersfield region. I'm now working with Joe's sister to carry out some research locally. So all these events have created, and these places have become signifiers. Hannah Jones, whose work has been profoundly sort of helpful, I think, about how community cohesion and other forms of multiculturalist policy have been understood and enacted. Talked about, based on her research and her own professional practice in East London, talked about how local authorities in the south of England saw these places in the north of England as signifiers of failure. They were the failure that they wanted to avoid, that national government was telling them they must avoid. So that overarching sort of concern is what shaped the content of the book. And what I'm now going to go on and do is talk in particular about today's theme, which is one of the key chapters. And I would, if I could move my slide on. Sorry. Sorry, there had some difficulty. We just froze a bit there. So the title of the chapter is From Oppressive Majority to Oppressed Minority. And it's really concerned with this strange situation where what remains by far the majority population in the region we're concerned about, and by far the economically, educationally most successful, arguably dominant community in the north of England, the white majority community, has parts of it, has strands within it who feel that they are actually a minority, that they are second-class citizens, they are forgotten minority, and that they are experiencing a sense or a reality in their view of unfairness. And this connects directly to this concept of them being either portrayed externally as a white working class, or even seeing themselves as this white working class. And directly, and obviously identifications are directly relational, they're fluid, they're contingent. That's the argument of the book generally, which is totally in contrast to the Huntington sort of clash of fixed civilizations thesis. So these feelings within white communities that we've researched with are in direct contrast to local BAME communities, and particularly the region's Muslim communities, and are directly seen as comparators by some of these communities. So these parts of white working class communities, and that contested concept is something I'm about to come on to, they've blamed policy priorities, that they've blamed multiculturalist policies, whatever that means, and portrayed that as being overt favoritism towards minority communities. But they've also identified the unfair, as they see it, and biased implementation of broader social policies, particularly around the way education and social goods such as education are not just allocated, but the way that they're administered. So unfairness within education is a frequent trope from white young people that we've researched with in places like Oldham and Rochdale, in Dewsbury, and I'm referring here to sort of research studies that we've published earlier in this sort of body of research. In housing, particularly allocations of social housing, access to social housing, but also to forms of regeneration funding. It was white community claims that regeneration funding was only going to ethnic minority communities was some of the fuel that led to the 2001 rioting in Oldham in the weeks beforehand. There's also been then these overt political manifestations that I referred to earlier. And arguably the Brexit vote and the manner of the Brexit debate in the region has also directly come from these feelings of resentment of second-class citizenships. So we found this repeatedly, such perceptions in our own research, but they've been found by a lot of other researchers, sociological researchers such as Catherine Smith, who did an excellent ethnographic study in a part of Manchester, the more political work of James Rhodes, looking at political dispositions and political behaviour in places like Burnley. But they've also been found in wider research in the UK and in Europe, in other locations, other national settings. And one example I'd point you to is the Open Societies Foundation report in 2014, which looked at white working class communities in 6 different locations, one of them being Manchester, but also in Rotterdam and Paris. And they found very similar feelings in these communities where they identified majority communities in areas of ex-industrial activity or deindustrialized communities. So using this term, the white working class, it has to be sort of very much directly sort of confronted. It's a highly contested concept sociologically, quite rightly, but also politically. It's also very topical. I don't know whether colleagues are aware, but the Education Select Committee of the House of Commons is currently taking evidence around the educational attainment of white working class boys. And there was a couple of evidence sessions last week that you can watch on Parliament TV, and I'd encourage you to watch them, had a couple of leading educational researchers like Diane Ray and Becky Francis, also some more political scientists like Matthew Goodwin, sorry. And Matt's opening line mentioned in his evidence, mentioned the cognitive ability of white working class pupils, which I felt personally was slightly unfortunate, but it certainly got newspaper headlines. Now, he went on to make much more nuanced points, but that highlighted how sensitive a sort of conception this is. And there was an excellent series of think pieces in 2009 published by the Runnymede Trust about this white working class concept, because the concept has clearly been used in the past by both the media and sections of politics to critique race equality measures themselves, suggesting that they're counterproductive or they're unnecessary. And Tarek mentioned that I worked previously at the Commission for Racial Equality, and I did feel slightly strange listening to this evidence session where ethnic monitoring data that obviously many activists worked for many years very hard to get, so we have a true picture of racial disadvantage. This data was being used in the select committee to show that white working class boys are the most disadvantaged, inherently then turning them into an ethnic community. It's also, this concept has also at the same time been used to arguably misportray white working class poverty or disadvantage as being something about their culture. And again, that's one of the reasons I'd encourage you to watch those sessions, because culture is repeatedly referred to and returned to by the chair of the session. The suggestion that there is an anti-educational culture within white working class communities, and so their disadvantage is because of that. Obviously, that it's a problematic concept in other ways, partly because nationally we know that white communities continue to be economically and socially advantaged compared to BAME communities. It's also problematic because who are these white people we're talking about? The work of Alistair Bonnet and other colleagues has showed very clearly that the term white and who is white is a fluid, complex, relational, contingent sort of concept. So, and it's changed over time. So I refer to Irish and Jewish immigration to the north of England in the second half of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And at no time in that period were those communities viewed as white. They were viewed as dark strangers, as threatening others. And it's only much more recently that they've been accepted as white. So white is a highly problematic term. Simply we know the working from all sorts of youth sociological research, the working class has never simply been white. There's always been a multiracial working class going back hundreds of years. And it's a misrepresentation of the working class, the way the white working class is discussed. So the select committee, and I'm using that as a sort of current proxy for this sort of debate, is very much focused on children on free school meals. Now, those are the poorest families, but by no stretch of the imagination is that a sociological representative sort of sample of the working class. The working class is much bigger. So quite often the debates about the white working class are talking about very specific economically marginalized segments of that working class. But nevertheless, there are arguments that the concept has some validity. So Michael Kenny has argued that not just some of the disadvantage that white majority communities face in some locations, but also the stereotype in their face. And he refers here to the chav sort of concept of the chav label. So he argues that there is a subaltern quality to the white working class in terms of its economic, but also its cultural marginalisation in modern society. What is beyond dispute in terms of talking about our region is that deindustrialization in the region has profoundly unmade the local identities, just as it made the local identifications in the region. the industrial experience which dominated the whole region made the identities and the experiences and the lives, but it's now also profoundly unmade them. So one of the key things we see as relevant to this topic, but also to the book as a whole, is the concept of social exclusion that David Byrne and other colleagues write about. And it's particularly the spatial dimension of social exclusion, how it happens to certain places. And one of our key arguments is ex-industrial towns in this region, social exclusion has happened. Arguably, it's Kant's idea of advanced marginality is also highly relevant to what's going on in these towns. And that's where our concern with political economy is important, to try and understand not just community relations, but also ethnic experience and community interrelations. So one thing we'd really identify is the connection between changing communities and changing perceptions within some of these economically marginalised white working class communities. So it's particularly the towns. And we've drawn on a lot of historical material from 60s, 70s in the book, as well as current literature. And it's really striking how concerns with racial disadvantage and white attitudes in the 60s and 70s focus on the big towns, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Bradford to a certain extent. Whereas the debate of the last 20 to 30 years is very much these ex-industrial towns, all those places mentioned on the map: Dewsbury, Keighley, Halifax, Huddersfield, Rochdale, Oldham, Ashton-under-Lyne. It's because those towns were dominated by industry that is now gone. And so what we identify is several processes going on at the same time that are not causal of each other, but are coterminous and seem to have a very big impact on the dispositions and the perceptions of white communities that we've researched with. So the data quotes that I'm using in today's presentation are all taken from a study we carried out in Dewsbury with white working class communities, which was commissioned by local authorities to try and understand feelings in the communities better using mixed methods. So you see the quote here that the lack of shops nowadays, the town's dead, it's disgusting. Though Dewsbury was a very rich, prosperous, bustling town while the textile industry was running. Now it's increasingly a ghost town. While we were carrying out this research 5 or 6 years ago, McDonald's closed down. Marks and Spencer's had already closed down, but when McDonald's closed down, there is literally nowhere after 5:30 in the centre of Dewsbury that you can go indoors, apart from some quite questionable pubs. You know, the idea of cafe society has never reached Dewsbury. So everything is being economic activity, jobs, cultural life has been sucked into the big cities. And it's that relationship between cities and towns, the political economy concern, that is damaging the towns, but also shaping perceptions. At the same time as the economy has declined, the ethnic minority communities have grown. So we mentioned demographic changes there. When the 2001 riots happened in Oldham, the South Asian school population was about 18%. By next year, it's predicted to be 44-45%. I shouldn't be surprised at that, because all migrant communities are younger, they have a different demographic profile, and it's an inevitable process. But the demography of towns is changing. And the fact that the demography has been changing as the town's economic and social infrastructure has been declining has led to a really racialized perception, particularly in older white adults, but also to young adults. And you see that highly contradictory quote there that all the shops are closing. Every shop is run by Asian now, all the shops are closing. And that really brilliantly sums up the sort of the dichotomy that's identified there. And what I should also say is, obviously, these processes have been going on at the same time as we've been members of the European Union. And I'll leave that one hanging there. So Paul Gilroy has talked a lot about sort of Britain's melancholia for like its colonial, its empire past, for a white past. And given the manner of the Brexit debate, that's very hard to challenge. But what we identify from our body of research is something somewhat different in this region, particularly in the white communities, which is actually a melancholy for a vibrant economic and social past, either one that was experienced by older generation or one that has been passed on through oral histories to younger generations. Paul Sheffer, who's well-known sort of writer within urban studies, expresses some sympathy for settled white communities in Western Europe who are trying to deal with this rapid social change, and says we need to understand some resentment towards newer migrant communities as an attempt to deal with rapid social change, including deindustrialization. And we've seen that even more, I suppose that plays into Putnam's concern with how social trust seems to decline as areas become more ethnically diverse. And a sort of more pessimistic take on that is by Merlin Schaefer, sort of Danish academic, who's talked about disintegration theory. And he's drawing there on Durkheim to say that when there is such rapid social change and negative spiraling downwards economic and social change, then there's these profound social anxieties will inevitably be projected onto minority and migrant outgroups. And he's carried out qualitative research across Western Europe and has some quite pessimistic sort of conclusions about these profoundly deindustrializing areas. So what this certainly identifies, there is the trope of self-segregation in both white and Muslim communities after 2001 riots. But what we really identify through our research is constrained choices, how social exclusion and economic decline really cuts off choice and possibilities of agency around housing and work, obviously for BAME communities, but also for white communities rather than self-segregation. So that leads on to this concept of the white backlash. And this is a historic phrase, and Ian Law, who wrote an excellent book some time ago about race and social policy, brightly highlights that every race equality measure that's been enacted in Britain from the 1960s onwards has faced some form of white backlash, whether it's political level or at a street level. So almost that comes with the territory of trying to create a more equal society. But we identify numbers of specific forms that come in people's perceptions and their behavior within marginalized white communities in the region. So one is the focus on markers of difference, increasing sort of unhappiness and agitation about dress, about mosques, etc., as visible signifiers of life changing, of the demographic profile and balance of local environment changing. Similarly, the idea of safe and unsafe space, particularly for younger people, is a historically established fact through the sociological work, going back to people like Phil Cohen, etc. Territoriality has always been part of youth experience, especially for working class young people. But what we find, especially in these towns like Rochdale, Dewsbury, is that it's a racialized unsafe space, a racialized sense of whose space is what. And I mean, I particularly commend the sort of groundbreaking work of Colin Webster, who did work in Keighley near Bradford in the 1990s, which showed this really well about how white and Asian young people identified space and fought over it. And what's happened in these ex-industrial towns is the Asian communities largely settled in the town centres. That was the cheapest housing, the only housing available given overt racial discrimination in both local authority and private rental markets. So now the town centres, these declining town centres, are very much identified with Muslim communities, with minority communities, by white communities live further out. So their sort of negativity about the town is also a racialized negativity. And that leads to all sorts of contingent race responses. Again, Tom Coburn's study of Blackburn there have sort of identified it, he researched with young BNP activists in Blackburn and identified that they'd become activists because they felt they'd been pushed off their local streets by Asian young people. And so they joined a racist gang, so quote unquote, to show that they had strength on their side. Actually, away from that setting, they had ethnic minority friends, but they took a very overt and contingent racist response to what they saw as a shifting balance of power at the street level. So I think what that plays into is the importance of the local and the emotions about it and changes to it. So Hilary Pilkington's excellent sort of ethnographic work with English Defence League activists really identifies how the local and the emotions was fundamental to their involvement. And as Hilary identifies in that quote there, the shifting balance, the shifting demographic balance, but also the shifting perception of who runs businesses, who's visible, etc., is frequently a prompt for getting involved in politics and feeling unhappy. Alongside that is perceptions around policy changes. Now, a lot of the resentment that's expressed in Hilary's study and others is about white communities feeling they've been moved further down waiting lists for social housing, feeling that more recently arrived communities, whether that's refugees and asylum seekers or more settled minority communities, families with more children or more needs, are seen as more deserving higher up the list. And that there is considerable resentment around that. What that obviously doesn't take cognizance of the fact is the policy changes of the last 30 years that have really significantly reduced the overall supply of social housing and the ability to access it. And this is a sort of debate that's been going on for some time. Colleagues might be familiar with the book, The New East End, that came out in 2006, which suggested that larger Bengali families in Tower Hamlets in East London and their need for social housing had really forced out white families further out to outer London. But of course, what that completely ignored was the profound reduction in the availability of social housing per se in London during that period. So in the absence of understanding or cognizance of these reductions in the availability and supply of social goods, concepts about who's got fairness and who's entitled become more and more important. And again, there's consistent sort of research from a lot of different settings that identifies different perceptions about the welfare state. And I guess this is the argument that people at David Goodhart make, that the welfare state was originally a contributory one. So he makes the argument that more settled, long-standing communities should have priority in access to social goods. Now, obviously, that's a debate one could have, but what that ignores is that fundamental reduction that's been made much worse by 10 years of austerity. That's underpinning then that backlash is this perception of unfairness, and fairness and unfairness is the term that comes up consistently in all the empirical literature about both the region I'm focusing on, but also the types of communities that I'm focusing on. This idea that there is queue jumping, that there is people who with less right to things. There's also, though, this feeling about the way social goods are administered. So the work of Roger Hewitt in the 1990s identified perceptions of unfairness from white working class pupils about the way rules were enacted within schools. And in fact, what he was picking up was something that was first identified in the Burnage report from the late 1980s in Manchester, when a Bengali background pupil was murdered by a white working class pupil in a high school in Burnage in Manchester. And what the report was kind of conducted by a panel of eminent, mostly BAME anti-racist activists and academics who identified clumsy anti-racist implementation within the school. And that seems to still be a feeling or still an experience, because research that we've carried out with white working class young people identifies a persistent claim that they are treated less fairly than ethnic minority pupils. And what I think we have here is something that we identify in the book, which is the Thomas theorem, which is from the Chicago School of Sociology, W.I. Thomas, who identified that if enough people believe something to be true, it is true in its consequences. And that's certainly true about white working class perceptions of equality and fairness within many school settings. But obviously, arguably, I mentioned earlier white privilege. And arguably what is being expressed here, and Hilary Pilkington speaks to this directly in the conclusion of her book, is that is there an inherent expectation within white communities that they should be in a superior position, either because of their longevity of connection to an area or even because of their whiteness? But what we've seen is a long history of political manifestations and political claim making, and there's a pre and post 2001 sort of divide here. That I think prior to 2001, there'd been a long history of extremist provocations where extremist right-wing groups have gone into either minority ethnic areas or even into white areas and attempted to provoke things. So, you know, there's the literature around the 2001 riots highlights in each case in Oldham, Burnley, Bradford, far-right agitators in the months and even the days before were highly active in agitating local white communities. If I say that the night before the Bradford riot in 2001, Nick Griffin was on one of the white working class estates that subsequently saw local problems as well as city centre problems. But what we've seen is more overt political manifestations. The votes for significant votes to the BNP, where they won 60 or 70 council seats in that period 2000 to 2008 in places like Burnley. Although what James Rhodes's work rightly identifies is actually a lot of that support has come from lower middle class voters rather than the most economically disadvantaged voters. And that's actually a well-known pattern in support for extreme right-wing sort of parties throughout history and in different national settings. The English Defence League rallies and similar groups that have come subsequently, such as the Infidels, etc., have drawn much more obviously on working class support and who seem much more concerned with their own localities and the economically, social, physical decline of those areas. But what comes across very clearly from our research and the research of other colleagues is a persistent feeling that these communities were not being racist, and the feeling that they are constantly being labelled as racist, not just by BAME campaigners, but by white middle class do-gooders as they see them. And it is that labelling of communities as racist for raising issues that is one of the reasons Michael Kenny suggests that we need to take political claim making by such communities more seriously. But what we can certainly identify is the support for Brexit in many of these towns in the region, many of the white working class communities, seems directly connected to some of the feelings and dispositions that I've discussed earlier. And the Hope Not Hate did a really interesting sort of report in the aftermath of Brexit, identifying that Brexit became a space where people expressed broader resentments at the pace of change and the loss they felt in their lives. And I think for me, that talks directly to those three different things all going on coterminous: European Union membership, growing ethnic diversity, profound economic decline, and increased precarity connected to that. So I suppose the last thing I meant, partly because Tarek referred, I do have a policy background. I guess it raises, what do we do with policy? Well, the first thing I'd say is that having worked in multiculturalist race equality policy, we put an unbearable weight on these policies, because I guess having foregrounded political economy and demographic changes in the region, the idea that multiculturalist policies can be the profound change agent is unrealistic. It's much more broader economic and social changes that will directly impact on people's perceptions and their fears. But it is true that those multiculturalist policies didn't really engage historically with white communities and identities, as Ali Ratansi identifies, didn't really know how to approach them. And on a very modest level, because of the modest funding, community cohesion work since 2001 has tried to engage with white communities. But I know from our own research that there's a real stumbling block there. So some of the white working class communities we've researched with, a problem becomes apparent immediately. There is virtually no civil society in those areas. It has been hollowed out. Faith adherence has declined, so the church is not there. Trade unions and Labour Party activism has largely declined. That's the vacuum that some extremists have filled. And so the only civil societies, things like sports clubs, which are not really equipped to play the community leadership role. Now, what we're not suggesting is that years of multiculturalist policy have created the strong ethnic minority civil society. That was there because of migrant experience and because of community activism, but it has supported and encouraged that. So we've got a very asymmetrical position where white working class communities don't have the capacity or the community leaders to lead processes of cohesion and of race equality work. I think in conclusion, our research in these communities shows that even though there's some highly negative and racialized feelings about others, about minority others, also people know that community relations need to get better. It's not a good or viable situation as it is, but there's a clear sort of dilemma about whose responsibility is it is. Is it minority communities' responsibility? Is it white communities? Is it the states? But certainly our closing sort of comment would be economic experiences and opportunities available matter, and particularly towns. So the broader talk about towns, and during the Labour Party leadership election earlier this year, Lisa Nandy was talking a lot about towns. She represents Wigan. And towns is a highly relevant concept in relation to what is going on in this region. We'd argue other parts of Britain in relation to ethnic diversity and racialised resentment. So anyway, thank you for that. Sorry if I've gone on slightly too long.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just trying to put my video back on. Thank you very much, Paul. That was really interesting, and you didn't go on too much. I think the timing was just right. And some people have already made comments and questions, both in the chat and the Q&A. I don't expect you to have been able to follow that, but I'll draw on that and bring the questions in. So the existing questions, and no doubt there'll be quite a few more, cover a number of areas. There are questions about comparisons between different groups of people, white and different minorities or so on. There are also questions about the far right, the vacuum or the opportunities that are created for far right activism in this region as there have been elsewhere. But maybe I could begin with a question that partly connects with what you said towards the end, but connects with where you began. So towards the end, you mentioned in terms of policies and so on, that someone like Ali Ratansi has said that multiculturalism seemed to leave white people, white communities out, as if multiculturalism is only about minorities. And of course, you began with saying that you're studying a space and you were motivated to study this space because of a discourse, both within the region and about the region, including by academics and commentators, that this is a failed space of multiculturalism, regionally and in terms of policies and in terms of social life. So in relation to that, do people who say this is a failed multiculturalism, do they think that multiculturalism has done better somewhere else, like London or some other part of England or Britain, or possibly, you know, elsewhere, or is it that this is just, oh, a case, possibly a bad case, but actually multiculturalism has failed everywhere else? You mentioned David Cameron at one point. Of course, he was talking about the country as a whole. And how this might relate to ideas about English nationalism. So you obviously talked quite a lot about a white resentment, which, you know, you rightly said is linked to political economy, a, you know, decline of economic life, industrial life. But I didn't hear you connect it with ideas about Englishness. You definitely connected it with ideas about Brexit. And a lot of people have argued that there's a very strong correlation with the Leave vote in the referendum and those people who identify themselves as mainly or only English rather than British. And might not someone say here that actually the partial success of multiculturalizing or multi-ethnicizing Britishness has led some people who feel, you know, that this multiculturalism is being bad for them, to seek an alternative national identity, namely an English kind of national identity, not because multiculturalism has failed at the level of national identity, but because it's regarded as being too British.
Slow response. So, Miah, thanks, Tarek, really helpful. I suppose I'd start with the national identity. So we significantly draw in the book on work that we did in Oldham and Rochdale with young people of all backgrounds. And one of the things we probed there was about the national identifications that meant something to them. And it was a very clear distinction. So the mainly Muslim young people, or the vast bulk of the BAME young people we work with, were very positive about Britishness, but saw Englishness largely as a white and quite a racial concept. Whereas the white working class young people we researched with saw Britishness as, well, they weren't negative about it, but they weren't very positive about it, but they were quite fiercely English and were overtly racial in some cases in terms of their connection of what it means to be English. Now, I think some of that is, we were doing that research, for instance, in the build up to the Scottish referendum. So I think there's a whole body of research that shows that ethnic minorities in the UK generally are positive about Britishness and have been historically, because Britishness is a multinational, multicultural, in some ways, you know, maybe it's under-identified, even multilingual. I mean, my own family I'm the first one not to speak Welsh in my family. So there is that background, but it feels like that's been unraveling through devolution. So one of the, when Labour were in power, one of the arguments John Prescott made for needing English regionalism was, if we've facilitated Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland to have real devolution, that's emphasising the distinct nations. If you don't then address with Englishness and also regional Englishness, it looks like there's an asymmetrical. So, and I think that's become true. And there's also a racial dimension to that. I guess, you know, there's been a lot of debate about the English flag and Englishness. You know, so Billy Bragg's for many years has tried to highlight this, that I think a lot of white liberals are very squeamishness about Englishness and the England flag, seeing it as an overtly racial symbol. I declare an interest. For some years I went abroad with England, so I have held that flag, and even though I've got a Welsh background. But you know, when I was growing up, it was the Union Jack was seen as the flag of the far right. Now it feels like the cross of St. George has been like the flag of the far right. But so whenever there's a football tournament, I make a point of putting my flag out, because it's almost like I'm with Billy Bragg. We have to reclaim that. But I think national forms of national identity do play a lot into this. I think in terms of where's worked, certainly in Britain. So I've worked with Ted Cantle, as you know, but I had quite a spiky debate with him some years ago, because in Ted's writing after the 2001 riots, he basically said the riots had happened in Bradford, Burnley and Oldham because they'd handled race relations, community relations, much less well than Leicester or say Southall. And our argument was that's just not right. What's different, the difference between Leicester and Southall is their economic trajectory, their economic possibilities in comparison to the thesis we've made. And I think this also relates to your own work, Tariq, like the PSI survey from the late 1990s. So the social capital of the different migrant communities in the 60s and 70s, and where in Britain they arrived. So the fact that a large part of Pakistani origin communities in Britain live on the M62 corridor, which promptly deindustrialized, is profoundly related to the economic and social disadvantage that community continues to face.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, next set of questions I was going to pick out from the chat and QA, kind of related to your last point. So at one point you said, and it seemed to be you speaking in your own voice rather than stating a research discovery, a perception, that white people in this region seem to be economically worse off than the ethnic minority communities. And you'd already told us, a slightly different point, that Muslims, and that means specifically South Asian Muslims, and you've now mentioned Pakistanis, as a community that became, through the loss of the textile industry, they were one of the biggest sufferers in terms of employment and earnings. So I was a bit surprised to hear you say that white people are economically more disadvantaged than ethnic minorities. And Karamat Iqbal asks, he says, certainly when it comes to people leaving school with benchmark qualifications, GCSEs and so on, that white children, boys in particular, are the worst off. Just in terms of that particular way of slicing issues about educational attainment.
Yeah.
But Pakistanis also are pretty badly off by the same measure, even if at the other end, for instance, if we look at higher education entry, Pakistanis may be doing better, especially if we bring in the working class factor. Pakistani working class children may be doing better in terms of getting into university than white working class children. Nevertheless, the Pakistanis are very polarized. Yeah. So at the other end, they're actually quite close to white working class, especially boys. Yeah. And Greg Smith asks, one group you didn't mention, but that are surely now part of the dynamic, are the East Europeans. So here's a couple of questions about comparative groups, especially in relation to their economic locations and trajectories. Yeah.
So first thing, Tariq, if it sounded like I said white communities are worse off, that was me misspeaking, because that's certainly what I intended to say. I think the argument is very much about place, and I think all communities in these places, in these towns, are economically disadvantaged. and the spatial location. So all the negative experiences of the white communities in places like Dewsbury are shared by the ethnic minority communities. So that's certainly not a suggestion at all. I think it's, in terms of educational attainment, I think it's a really interesting one that, you know, there's a whole set of educational researchers who've been arguing quite fiercely over what's going on with ethnic attainment for many years. You know, like they talk about the London effect. So is it the significant improvements by Bangladeshi communities? Is that about the community, or is it about the London Challenge work that went on? Is it about place, or is it about the community and what how the community has responded? I think that, so I've worked, you know, as you say, I worked at the Commission for Racial Equality. I worked on ethnic monitoring. I was involved in census categories, etc. But as I teach students, the ethnic monitoring is a double-edged sword, because the danger is that you think the social problems you can capture are created by the categories you're using. And so I felt very uncomfortable listening, as I said, to the Education Select Committee, going from free school meals white pupils to talking about Pakistani attainment, because they're absolutely talking about oranges and pears. They're not about Pakistani pupils on free school meals and white pupils on free school meals. And I think some of this is the limitations of ethnic monitoring, when we don't have much better ways of monitoring and talking about social class. I mean, that's some of the mess we have with trying to understand the ethnic dimension of educational achievement or ethnic access. But there certainly are sociological debates, I think, about why particularly boys from working class communities, of all communities, are accessing further and higher education less. Whether there's actually an ethnic dimension to that rather than a class one and a gender one is, I think, quite contentious.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, Penny Soteropoulou asks specifically about the dimension of gender in the representation that groups have of each other. So she asked, why is there this focus on the white working class? Well, why is the white working class thought to be mainly boys and men? And what about minority sexualities? How do they, if at all, feature in the representations of one's own community and of other communities? But specifically here, gender and women surely are very important. I mean, obviously, you made some reference to the sexual abuse gangs and all the prosecutions that have taken place or are currently being investigated. But also, we know that so much of the cultural hostility to Muslims is expressed in terms of things like Muslim women's dress. In fact, you had one quote on one of your slides. Yeah, so do you want to say more about gender and sexuality in the landscape that you've been describing?
Sure. And before I do that, Tarek is aware that I didn't respond to the colleague who asked about Eastern Europeans.
Oh, yes.
So
yes.
there's a couple of things I'd say about that. That unlike the big cities, and this city-town sort of divide has become, you know, it's quite central to what we're saying. Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool have become genuinely super diverse in vertex sort of concept. That's only really happened in the last 10 to 20 years. Whereas the towns have really been duocultural for decades. But that's slowly been changing. It's been changing in two ways, and it's been changing during the time we've been researching. One is relocation of asylum seekers, refugees, which has brought some African background people to places like Rochdale, Dewsbury, etc. But also the much larger scale Eastern European, the A8 countries. And that's come in a variety of ways. It's some of the racialized sort of resentment that we got from white working class young people was actually about other white Europeans as much as the settled South Asian communities, and was also leading to slightly counterintuitive sort of realities, like, for instance, listening to young people in Dewsbury, white young people, saying they gang together with local Asian young people to take on the Hungarian kids who were now trying to muscle their way in. So in a way, that was reassuring that from a Chicago school point of view, them become us eventually, but that, you know, that might be. So I think the Eastern European influence has been very significant. It's certainly added to perceptions of job competition, and that also then rebounds onto settled minority communities in terms of perceptions as well. Gender and identity is an interesting one. I think there's a strong argument for saying the white working class is a very gendered concept. I think it's been driven by two things. One is this 15, 20 years concern with the educational attainment of white boys, and it is boys. That's what Robert Halfon's looking at now, white boys. So, and also, I guess it's the political manifestations, particularly the street protests, the English Defence League, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly aggressive, very macho behaviour. And I think those two things have done that. But I think not just our own research, but other political scientists would caution the sort of conclusion that these feelings are very gendered, that they're not shared by women in the communities. And we were actually disabused of that. That we only ever say found a minority support for people like the EDL, but there is just as likely to be girls. And when we women, and when we probed that, some of that was, say, bad experiences with minority men. But then some of those bad experiences relate to relationships or interactions that had gone wrong. You know, so there is plenty of social interactions of all kinds, even in these apparently very divided, whether it's fancying someone, whether it's buying or selling drugs across the divide, there's all sorts of youth subcultural things going on at the same time as apparent apartheid. So I think the gender dimensions are very interesting. Certainly, I think Hilary Pilkington's work shows that there's some echo, say, of LGBT or women activists getting involved, partly because they see threats about behaviour or policing of lifestyle from sections of minority communities. And of course, we've seen that right across Europe. Pim Fortune and his movement in Holland was very much about perceived assaults on the LGBT community from Islamist activists. So I think that's not new. It's not unique to our region.
Yeah. Maybe we could allow you to take up some issues to do with political economy. So Colin Webster is attending this webinar, and he, I mean, he says, well, some of the things that I've been asking you about, division between communities and so on, may well be driven by the common experience of economic and industrial decline, a point you made yourself, in fact, referring to Colin Webster. So that's an opportunity to perhaps take that a bit further. But related to that, Lisa McKenzie is also with us, and good to have you both, Colin and Lisa. She says, well, is it so strictly connected with the economy in the sense that a community that she is very familiar with, I wonder if you are, St. Anne's in Nottingham.
Well, I've read Lisa's work and it's great. So
It's a very poor community and is multiracial, but doesn't have the kinds of divisions that you're talking about, even though it suffers lots of hardships and by lots of measures like, you know, crime and what we might call, you know, youth misbehavior and delinquency and so on. It would be regarded as a problem, and some people would not want to live there if they could get out of it and so on. But just because there's poverty, I mean, that's almost like the shared experience, which seems to mute potential division by race, ethnicity, and that sort of thing. So if you'd like to take up the issue of political economy and decline.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to Colin for raising that. I think I suppose there's a couple of observations about the way the dominant economic mode in the region has shifted. So if you look at the work of someone like Verinda Kalra from textile mills to taxi ranks, and he identifies how in the 60s, 70s, although shifts in textile mills were racially segregated to a certain extent, and Oldham, there was significant racism in wider Oldham society. There was also significant joint trade union activity, some socializing with people who worked at the same. So there was some sort of conviviality, some sort of integration. And one of the things that's happened across the region as industry has gone is how people end up in insecure work. So, and often that insecure work is in their own community. And we found that very strongly in the youth research we did in Rochdale, where some of the, say, Asian background young people were highly negative about white communities. And when we probed it, their interactions or their families' interactions, their dads or their brothers, were very bad experiences driving white people in taxis, trying to serve them in restaurants or takeaways. But equally, some of the white young people were recounting the other side of that story. So it's almost like there were encounters, but not any sort of depth to them. And they were the worst type of contact. It just shows how contact, in terms of contact theory, can be highly negative. And that's the sort of economy we've ended up with. Whereas the sites of, whether you want to call it conviviality or integration, in a lot of these towns with limited economic possibilities are actually the further education colleges or the universities, where people are there as equals, and even if they live in residentially distinct settings, that's where it comes together. But without the economic possibility of working with people, then there's the danger of not understanding, but also then obviously the danger of projection. And also thanks for Lisa's comment. It's really like Lisa's work, and from what I know, and Lisa might correct me on this, but my sense is that St. Anne's is mostly African, Caribbean and white. And I think there's a very, very interesting broader sociological thing there, that if we go back to, say, the 1960s and 70s, there was very distinct African, Caribbean origin communities in places like Bradford, Oldham, Huddersfield, as well as obviously Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. Very residentially type-faced, real, if you talk to older African Caribbean people in Leeds, live in the area, so I live in Leeds, we'll talk about how it's unsafe to go to the city centre right up in the daytime, let alone the nights, right up to the 1980s. Whereas now, those communities have almost disappeared in the sense of a residentially clustered sense, through intermarriage, through like moving to different areas, etc. So again, we're talking about long Chicago School sociology here. Will that happen generally with South Asian, and it is happening with some South Asian communities, but why is it not happening with the mainly Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities on the M62 corridor? Well, there's cultural explanations put forward, obviously, about that sense of intermingling. Because we'll talk about alcohol, talk about pubs, we'll talk about types of sport, types of leisure activities. And we disagree with that. One, because if you look at the music scene, say, there is lots of interracial mixing in certain types of youth leisure, but also it's about blocked economic transitions. And the conviviality in the M62 corridor amongst young people of different backgrounds is in the educational sites. Those are the only sites, by and large, that there are.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, here's a question that in some ways is the flip side of what you've just been answering to. I mean, and you want to make a distinction between towns and cities, and a distinction also possibly between different groups. And your remark about what has happened to the African Caribbean community, especially residentially and in terms of partnerships and marriage and so on, actually reminds me of a comment, well, it was more than a comment, that Orlando Patterson, another US sociologist of American origin, so you've been talking about the Chicago School. Well, Patterson argued quite a long time ago that the West Indian origin, African Caribbean community, would probably be amalgamated into the big white population, as it was in the 19th century. He said, oh, well, that will happen again. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be proved right. In fact, circumstances demographically are actually quite different. But nevertheless, that does show a certain kind of historical character or tendency. But the question I was actually going to raise comes from Steve Garner and is the opposite, if you like, of the point that's just been made. So Steve says, Paul, thanks very much for your presentation. What strikes me is the similarity of the discourse in places that are deindustrialized and others that don't share that trajectory at all. This is quite an interesting problem because it's almost as if the geographical variables are not significant. And here it means geographical and geoeconomic variables are not significant. What are your thoughts about this kind of sameness?
Yeah. Hi, Steve, first of all, another person whose work has been very helpful. Hard to, I guess, what the starting point for the book as a whole, as well as the chapter, was these projections from the outside, these descriptions from the outside of a region that we feel passionately about because we live here and we work here. We've worked in different ways. And, you know, we've made the arguments we make. How we think what we're suggesting helps to understand or analyze what's going on and why we've got the feelings, emotions, behaviors we have. But whether we're claiming a uniqueness, I don't know. And I guess some of the Brexit sort of the analysis of who felt what about Brexit suggests that it's not just these ex-industrial areas. And I suppose that's a continuing debate about, was it just older white working class voters in ex-industrial towns who drove it? And no, it wasn't. There was plenty of middle class, mainly white people in much more leafy suburban areas. There's also a significant number of ethnic minority people who drove it as well. So I'd be interested in hearing more from Steve about that at some point, because it's, yeah, I suppose we're not claiming there is a uniqueness of this region or our analysis, but I think we're trying to understand our region better. And I guess I was just referring back to your sort of comment, Tariq. I mean, yeah, throughout the book as well as the presentation, I guess we're doing what Yasmin Gunarathan talks about, not working with and against race, and we're very conscious about talking about identities and communities without necessarily trying to accept them or talk into them. But also struck me about, you know, older sociologists used to talk about the Irish route and the Jewish route of ethnic integration. I don't know whether that's still, certainly I think in popular discourse, some people still see it in those terms. You know, there's possibly an argument that that's still a live debate.
Yes, that was Kerry Peach that came up with that formula, I think, around the 1980s. As we move into the last 5 minutes of our session, perhaps I could throw two questions at you, very broad brush questions, and allow you to discuss them as you think best, Paul. One is to do with the political opportunities for extremist politics, in particular far right and racist parties, and you mentioned EDL obviously, and the role of Nick Griffin in the Bradford riots and so on. But it's still the case that going back to the beginning of your talk, when you said, well, actually the phenomenon that we're studying here is present elsewhere, and you mentioned the banlieues in France as an example, and you could have mentioned others. It's still the case that the far right in Britain, in terms of separate parties, has not really taken off in any part of the country in the way that it has, for instance, in France. I mean, in France, we have a major challenger to the mainstream parties, whereas something different has happened in Britain. And people sometimes say this is because, we have first past the post system, which makes it very difficult for new political entrants. And it's more likely that they they become more like pressure groups, and one of the bigger parties adopts some of their cause and agenda. If you'd want to discuss that. And then one thing that really hasn't been mentioned at all, or hardly at all anyway, is religion and religious identity. What kind of role might that play? You said in terms of white civil society, you know, the church is a declined presence. You mentioned reference to Islamism in relation to the LGBT communities and how they might be presented, or people might think they are perceived by Muslims. And you mentioned that the 7/7 bombers came from West Yorkshire. But beyond that, we've been talking about, you know, race and ethnicity in the context of deindustrialization. But is religion got some dynamic over and beyond race, ethnicity, and class?
So talk about the far right first. I think we found very little support for people like the EDL, and that, you know, there's a long history of research that shows there's very little support. I think what's more concerning is forms of populism, and obviously Cass Mudd and colleagues we're having types of populism that is quite xenophobic, quite racist, and you know, you could argue that Brexit was a spasm of that type, but would we get something like that? Religion is really interesting. I think certainly one of the things that we identify in our research is the asymmetrical nature within these communities of religious adherence. You know, faith and faith activism and involvement is obviously very strong in the mainly Muslim communities, has largely disappeared, particularly in the most white working class communities, although there's danger overplaying it. You know, the strength of, say, the Bradford Catholic school system several generations after Irish immigration shows that there's certain cultural adherence. But I think there's some fantastic I saw one of the questions from a colleague about policy implications, day-to-day practice youth workers, and there is some fantastic ground level work, say interfaith work, like the Oldham Interfaith Forum that Shamim's been very involved in, but that butts up against this asymmetrical nature. So it isn't just a lack of civil society in some of the white working class communities, but it's not faith-based. Now that doesn't make it, you can't overcome it, but there is a distinction there that's a real one, and certainly the markers of faith adherence, whether it's mosques, new mosques appearing, or, you know, there's a question about gender earlier, and obviously work with people like Yasmin Hussein in terms of women being assaulted because of their visible dress. So whether that's really about religion or whether that's just a way of racialized responses to difference is another matter.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure everybody would give you a loud round of applause if they weren't muted. So thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I hope people want to read your book as a follow-up.
I was just going to say, but yeah, thanks for taking part, people, and just email me if you got any questions or any I'd value any feedback or comments, so do please sort of email me.
Great, and thank you everybody for attending. The next Ethnicity Centre webinar is on the 19th of November. Per Moritzen of Aarhus University, Denmark, will be talking about citizenship requirements and what might be called liberal integration in Scandinavia. So please join us then, and thank you and good evening. Bye-bye.